Hello, everybody. This is Reverend Brian Blair. You are here on Crossroads, the show where we talk about the intersection of a person's faith life and their everyday life. Our special guest today is Dr. Glenn Mitoma, who's a professor here at UConn. The opening song, by the way, is not the usual song. I just got back from a nice vacation in Spain. I want to thank everybody around here at WHUS who covered for me and played a pre-recorded show. While I was away, I met this really fun musical group and got their CD. There's a wonderful music school in Murcia in Spain, and they were some students from there. And that was a little sample of their CD. I think they called Tuna Medicina, but my Spanish isn't the best. Anyway, look them up. They got a website. They're on Twitter. Let's see here. Well, you'll figure it out. Check out Tuna Medicina. Everyone, my guest today is Dr. Glenn Mitoma, and we're here at Crossroads. We're going to say hello to him in just a second, but we're 91.7 FM, WHUS Stores. Again, I'm Reverend Brian Blair. You can check me out at Rev Blair on Twitter, or go to my website, revblair.com, where every show is put up as a podcast later in the day and also as a YouTube video. And usually at this time, I would have some announcements about what's going on in the area. I don't have any right now, but I'm here with Glenn, who is involved in quite a bit. Glenn, do you have anything you'd like to share about any activities going on in the community?
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here, by the way. So thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Announcements-wise, there's always a lot going on. As we'll get into, I'm director of the Dodd Center. So anybody who wants to come over right now, we have a special exhibit up called In the Crosshairs. It's a retrospective of the work of a journalism professor, Scott Wallace, that focuses on his time covering the wars in Central America in the 1980s. Really powerful stuff. And then in the wider community, as we'll also get into, I live here in Mansfield, and we're CSA members, and this Friday I know there's an event at the community center from 5:30 to 8:30 that's focused on farms and friends here in Mansfield. It'd be great to have people come out, meet your local farmers, maybe join a CSA. So that's a couple of things that are going on right now in the community.
Farms and friends. That's great. Thanks for letting us know about that. There's one thing going on campus every Friday at noon now at St. Mark's Episcopal Chapel. The organist there is playing free organ concerts at noon. So if you enjoy organ music, if you want a nice relaxing place to have lunch, stop by St. Mark's. Make sure you call ahead just to make sure that there's music that day. Well, like I said, I'm here with Dr. Glenn Mitoma. It's great to have you on, Glenn. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do here at UConn?
Absolutely. So I am the director of the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, which I just mentioned, and I'm also an assistant professor with a joint appointment in our Human Rights Institute and the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. So I focus on human rights education.
Very nice. I'd like to talk about human rights in a minute, but what could you tell us about the Dodd Center?
So the Dodd Center has been around for over 2 decades now. It was inaugurated in 1995, which happened to be the 50th anniversary of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg following the Second World War. And that's important because Thomas J. Dodd, in addition to being a senator from Connecticut, served as executive trial counsel to the IMT during that immediate post-war period. And that service was of tremendous importance to the global struggle for human rights, but also helped to shape Tom Dodd's view of the world as somewhere that required intervention in support of human rights. And so our mission at the Dodd Center, as it was conceived back in the 90s, was not only to protect and preserve Tom Dodd's legacy in the form of his personal papers. We house them in our Archives and Special Collections Department, but also to advance a broader mission, which we articulate as promoting a culture of human rights here at UConn, in Connecticut, and around the world. And so that's really what we're all about over there. In addition to hosting exhibits and housing the archives and the Human Rights Institute and the Center for Judaic Studies, we also have a mission to promote human rights more broadly.
promoting human rights. Great. What brought you to this kind of work?
Well, I've actually been at UConn for 10 years now. So
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. It's hard to imagine. But I originally came as a postdoctoral fellow with a program that at the time was known as the Foundations of Humanitarianism program, and is today as the research program in humanitarianism through the Human Rights Institute. And I came fresh out of graduate school. I had a PhD in cultural studies, and I was really engaged in trying to understand the history of the international human rights system. And my first book is on the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And over my time here at UConn, I became increasingly involved in developing the academic program in human rights. As you may know, UConn is one of only a handful of schools in the country that offers an undergraduate BA in human rights. And I participated in the development of some of that curriculum and the establishment of that program. And that really presented to me some interesting questions of human rights education practice. So, quite apart from the historical scholarship, but how do we advance an understanding of and a capacity to act in support of human rights. And that's really where and how I became involved in the Dodd Center. And so when they asked me to serve as interim director about 5 years ago, I said yes, as it seemed like an interesting new challenge for me. And then over the course of the last 5 years, I've really come to see this as an essential part of the university's obligation with respect to human rights. Not only to do this frontline research, and we have really the best faculty in the world conducting research on all kinds of important human rights topics, and not only in the classroom in terms of training students in a set curriculum, but working with the community, working with stakeholders, working with civil society actors to really advance human rights as a way of life in our community.
You use the term obligation. So I wondered if you couldn't explain a little bit more about why you would feel like a university, a state university, has an obligation.
Well, our university, as you know, is a land-grant university, and so we're special even among universities. But I think all universities have a larger mission as independent social institutions to serve the communities they're located in and connected to. And the mission of universities and the mission of higher education historically has been thought of much more broadly than just in individualistic terms, right? Not just as a place for individuals to come to get job training or skills that they could then go out on the market and monetize, but actually serve collectively to advance the interests, concerns, and welfare of the people. And that is particularly true for a land-grant university. Land-grant universities were created in the 19th century with a very specific mission to advance the welfare of the communities in which they were located. And that has expressed itself in different ways over the decades since the establishment of the Morrell Land Grant Act. And today really is embedded within the kind of three legs of the university's mission: the research leg, the teaching leg, but also this service and outreach leg. And to be quite frank, I think we could use more effort put into that third leg, that emphasis on our service and outreach obligations, and to really be members of the communities that we serve, and to be good citizens of those communities.
Well, did you hear that, UConn? He's being frank, and you need to do more service. Let's see how that works. I'm glad you gave us that explanation. What I really appreciated about it personally is that sometimes I will be saddened by what I hear as an anti-intellectual strain in certain conversations, which I feel distracts us from what we're really all about as humanity, coming together, breaking down barriers, not creating them. And I like your explanation because I think it really is about that, breaking down barriers, not creating them, figuring out ways communities can work together.
That's a great point, Brian. I mean, I think the notion of dialogue needs to be embedded in all of the things that we do as a university, and maybe part of the anti-intellectualism that's kind of creeped into our public discourse is not helped by oftentimes us as university professors kind of speak in an academic jargon that can be alienating for lots of folks that can appear needlessly technical and obscure. And so by focusing on practices that support dialogue, and of course dialogue is both speaking but also most importantly listening, maybe we can overcome some of these assumptions and barriers about language and who speaks for what audience and who has authority and insight. Because I think, frankly, the university has a lot to offer, but it also has a lot to learn from engaging our communities.
I like that you use that question, who has authority? That's an important one. You mentioned the idea of dialogue, and I want to get to some other questions, but you and I talked earlier, and you mentioned something that you're doing at the local high school around dialogue that I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the E.O. Smith High School, which is also here in Mansfield, and we've, through the Dodd Center, we've supported some of these efforts at different high schools around Connecticut, but the one at E.O. in particular has been really exciting. There's a large group of students there who are participating in a program called Democratic Discourse, and they're doing so that they can learn both how to engage in dialogue that's productive, but also be facilitators of dialogue among their peers, among their parents, among their community members, and really be a resource for the community to have productive conversations about difficult topics. And so this group of students has received training on dialogue facilitation. They've worked on researching topics that can be the subject of dialogue and creating these facilitation guides that are used during these dialogic forums, and then have crafted reports and worked to take action to support recommendations that come out of it. So it's really been an impressive thing to watch these young people take responsibility for their own communities, and that's a really exciting development. I think not only here locally in Mansfield, but potentially more broadly across the country.
I think that is a wonderful thing to do for any community, to help people learn and do a better job at having dialogues. I also like the idea that you mentioned at the very end, taking responsibility for your community, being proactive in your community. Thanks. I asked you a minute ago what brought you to working at the Dodd Center. Part of what was behind that question is the next part of what I wanted to get to, which is part of what we do on this show is ask people to explain what faith means to each person and how faith informs what they do in their everyday life. So you made a decision at one point that you were going to be the director of the Dodd Center. Could you give us a little bit of a description or explanation about what you consider to be faith? And then is there a link between how you came to the Dodd Center and how you work at the Dodd Center with your faith?
That's a great question, and really cuts to it. So thanks for that,
Sure.
Brian. Yeah, it gets me off my talking points a little bit about the Dodd Center. But yeah, I mean, I think in some ways I took the job at the Dodd Center in part to respond to what I saw was a need, which was for someone to address this really applied work in human rights here. And for me, this question of responding to a need and responsibility are rooted in my understanding of faith as those commitments we have before our analytic mind kicks in. Right? They're these kind of foundational orientations and dispositions that, again, we do need to reflect on them. They're not immune from consideration or refinement, but they're there a priori in some ways, and help propel us forward in our relations with others and with our community. And so, I think the abiding faith that helped shape my own kind of both intellectual as well as personal engagement with human rights has been a recognition of responsibility to my fellow human beings in some fundamental sense, and the recognition that comes from seeing people in need in some ways, and not just the quote unquote the people who get quote unquote labeled needy, right? In what can be a very problematic framing, but to see other human beings as they are, as humans with dignity and in need of recognition. So I think those are the kinds of things that help shape my own decision to take this on. But more importantly, has been a component about how I've tried to make decisions throughout the work, subsequent to deciding to step into the role, right? Because, as with most of us, we take new things on mostly in total ignorance of what we're getting ourselves into, and that's for the good, right? Because if we knew,
That's
sometimes
why
we
people
wouldn't
have
do
children, right?
it. Absolutely, that's right. It's kind of behind the veil of ignorance, right? And I think. As I've had a chance to experience being in this role, to start programs in partnership with others, to see how others have responded to those, and then to have to try and refine and change what I'm doing, a lot of that has been guided by this kind of primordial set of commitments to, responsibility. Responsibility in the face of the other, as Emmanuel Levinas would say.
Very nice. I like the quote. I keep thinking of something from Christian scripture where it says faith without works is dead. And I like that you keep returning to the idea of making sure that you're actually engaging with people, learning how to engage with people, and making sure that it's not just something that's felt, it's something that's done. So I see that as a pattern in everything that you're describing. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. In some ways it's deliberate, but also it's out of necessity. I think one of the things that happened as I stepped into this role is I realized I had no real training in this kind of work prior to this in my academic career. My undergraduate degrees it's a fine art degree in photography. My graduate degrees are in cultural studies, which is a kind of interdisciplinary, very theoretical humanities field. And the work of dialogue, of speaking and engaging across difference, is not something that was embedded in any of those fields. And so, as a point of necessity, I had to listen. I had to seek out others who had the expertise I didn't, and who weren't in those kind of traditional positions of authority and expertise, to refer back to what we said earlier, who are in communities and doing this work. And so, as a kind of form of my own self-education, that's how I began to work. And then once you begin to work that way, you realize, why would you work any other way, right? So I think it's evolved over time out of that set of practices.
Well, you're talking about the Dodd Center and working there. You've mentioned how it has a focus on human rights. How would you define the notion of human rights? You mentioned earlier also about your work. Was it your first book, or you said it was your dissertation?
Both, yeah.
Okay, so on how the United Nations defines human rights as well.
Right.
If
yes.
there's a difference.
There is, certainly, right? As with all things that are produced by kind of large institutions, the official UN definition, there's a lot of cooks in that kitchen, and so the end result is maybe not as clear as any one contributor would have liked. Nevertheless, I think, again, the focus of my early work was on the origins of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, like the Nuremberg tribunals, were a product of the experience of the Second World War. Right, it was adopted in 1948, for all its flaws and compromises, that's still a remarkably powerful and important document. And in one way that certainly resonates with my own definition is the way in which they center that notion of human dignity as at the core of our understanding of human rights, that it's a call to our own responsibility for our own dignity and the dignity of others that is at the kind of the center of the human rights ethos. And I tend to, in my classes on human rights, I tend to talk about human rights as a concept with two faces, kind of a Janus-faced concept, one side that faces toward morality and one side that faces toward law. And on the morality side, it is this question of an ethical response to the fundamental, equal, and inalienable human dignity of each and every human being. And on the legal side, it is an obligation to translate into concrete laws and policies protections for that dignity. And so human rights is both those things at once, right? It's that essential core of human dignity, but it's also that set of rules and institutions and treaties and obligations that we've built up around it to support that. And that also means it's dynamic, right? Because our understanding of human dignity, and in particular the threats to human dignity, unfold over time and transform as we recognize, actually, unfortunately, all the different ways that human dignity has been violated in the world. And so, today we talk a lot about gender identity and expression as one of the critical areas in which human dignity is at risk, that people are denied human dignity because of their gender expression. That was certainly something that was not on the minds of the vast majority of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 1940s. But human rights can and does accommodate that if we attend to both of its faces, not just the legal side, but the moral side.
Very quickly, with the notion that this thing is always evolving, a lot of conversations these days deal with social media, and social media has an impact on society and how we all work with each other. You talked about dialogue earlier. And just a few seconds, if you don't mind, just going off on the side here. Have you considered that, the impact of social media on human dignity as it pertains to human rights?
Well, I think this is an area that we're only now starting to kind of plumb the depths of. I think all of these digital technologies are profoundly important, all across our social fabric and down to our individual psychologies. And the kind of scope and nature of that impact will only begin to sketch. So that's the kind of caveat, of me again pleading my own ignorance. I have no idea.
I'll answer the question, but
I think at least from my perspective, social media is not conducive to actual dialogue. That Facebook posts and tweets are unfortunately easily decontextualized and intentionally or unintentionally misread. And I think that then serves as a basis not for true dialogue, but for essentially some sort of discursive combat. And then, add to that bad faith actors that are kind of indistinguishable from genuine people in these spaces. And you've got a really difficult environment to navigate in.
I didn't chuckle, by the way, everybody out there, at what Glenn said. Just generally speaking, the first image that popped to mind is the couple who gets into it texting because one person in the couple doesn't understand what the text really was about, and then you're having a back and forth, and how tragic that really is, that people aren't really communicating and they don't understand the context, and this kind of thing can go sideways very quickly. And here we are all really talking to one another quite a bit every day using these devices and this method. So how could we hope that we were going to have wonderful dialogue back and forth? So more and more, I appreciate the work that you do around dialogue and what the center does as well. I think we need it.
Thank you. I mean, I think, it didn't take necessarily a genius to realize that that's exactly right, that people are craving this. And I think, there are others out there who've been doing this for a long time, and we've become involved increasingly, in part because, going back to what we mentioned with respect to the project at E.O. Smith, the fact is we just haven't been exercising that democratic muscle very much in recent history. And for some reason, in the past couple of years, we realized that we're suffering from this this democratic deficit. And so building up the opportunity for us to deliberately engage in this work. Again, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally to us, right? It's kind of awkward to sit around a table and have a dialogue about important issues. We need those supports, those infrastructure, that opportunity to practice together if we're going to build up our capacity to do the hard work of, creating our communities together.
Well, I want to move from there to a question about the Dodd Center that I find very interesting. So first of all, when I think of the Dodd Center and its mission and its origins, as you explained them, it seems like a very odd paradox to me, because the history of the Holocaust involves one religious group being sorely persecuted, to put it mildly. And I think that at that time it would be safe to say that a majority of Europeans would have considered themselves to be Christian. So that one assessment reasonably could say that a lot of Christians were involved in perpetrating the Holocaust. So you have one religious group persecuting another one. But then you also have this mix of those same religious groups coming together to, of course, stop that persecution and then be involved in the healing afterwards. So you have to manage a center that has its origins in some of those ideas. Do these questions and issues ever come up? Do you ever find yourself in a sticky situation where you have to engage in a conversation around religion, whether you want to or not? And then how do you handle those things?
That's a really interesting question and way of framing it, Brian. I think rather than sticky, I think oftentimes there are uncomfortable conversations, but that's when the conversation is good.
You're the master of dialogue.
Yeah, well, whether you're master or not, you're put on the spot a lot of times and required to engage. I will say, right, I mean, the Dodd Center, the office that I direct is this focus on outreach and engagement for human rights. There's the building overall, though, has many different units in it, one of which is the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. And it's precisely this connection with the origin of the center in the Holocaust that we try and highlight there. And the Center for Judaic Studies is a very rich place for those kinds of conversations. But from my perspective, it's absolutely essential that the conversation about human rights not be limited to just politics and law and the kinds of topics that academics are more comfortable engaging in, but have to speak directly to the core of what's meaningful in people's lives. And for a vast majority of human beings, these include questions of faith and religion. On the specific score of the Holocaust, it's an incredibly complex story, as you acknowledge, and so I think we should attend to that in our work going forward.
Well, that was a great response. I appreciate it. Sadly, we are out of time. I think we could be at this for another 2 hours easily. Everybody, this is WHUS Stores, Connecticut. I am the Reverend Brian Blair. This show is Crossroads, where we ask people about the intersection of their faith life and their everyday life. Our guest today has been Glenn Mitoma here, the director of the Dodd Center. You've been great, Glenn. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Brian. This was great.
Well, everybody out there, stay safe in the weather today, and we hope to see you again next week.